Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I'm Robert Nash, and I'm the president of the Winnipeg branch of the Canadian International Council. Welcome to our event, which is coming to you live from Winnipeg, Manitoba. This is our second event in our speakers program for 2021-2022. Between now and June, we are looking forward very much to offering a mix of in-person and online events as a condition. While it will be so nice to meet with people face to face once again, the Zoom genie will never be back into the model. Local events offers the opportunity to highlight local talent and expertise, as we see. Online events offers the opportunity to present experts from afar and to give local experts a wider audience. Hybrid events might just afford us the best of both options. If this is your first time with us, welcome. We hope that you like what we have to offer. If you have been with us before, thank you for your patronage. We look forward to seeing those of you who live in Winnipeg in person this year, and please consider supporting us by joining the CIC. This evening, we have 4 speakers, Dr. Andrea Charron, Dr. Michael Nesbitt, Danielle Cherpako, and Erin Tramley. They will speak about Canada's use of sanctions as a tool of international diplomacy and explain the work behind the creation of the Canada Sanctions Map. Our moderator this evening is Jason Quinn. Jason is a member of the Winnipeg branch executive and worked with Danielle and Erin on the Canada Sanctions Map project under the direction of Dr. Sharon. Our panelists will speak for approximately 30 minutes in total, after which Jason will moderate a question and answer session. Given the Canadian response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I imagine that this audience will have lots of questions about the
I think we lost you, Robert. All right, so I think Robert lost connection there, so we'll just get started. Speaking first will be Dr. Andrea Charron. She's an associate professor of political science at the University of Manitoba. So I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you to the CIC for the invitation, and thank you very much to the people who have made this possible, which is the students, and this is largely to showcase their research. I have 3 take-home messages for you about Canadian sanctions. One is the contested world order that we're living in, and today has been abundantly clear that the world order is under threat. How Canada and the West has sanctioned has definitely changed. 2, the lack of Canadian foreign policy that we have, and this is for successive governments, means that how we are sanctioning is lacking some coherence and especially coordination, not only with allies, but also with other foreign policy tools. And finally, 3, there are steps that we can take to improve the quote unquote effectiveness of sanctions, but it's not a magic wand that we can wave to make them instantly effective. And so we need to keep it in perspective. So my bottom line up front is that it is the preferred coercive tool of the government of Canada, but the legislation that we have lacks efficacy. And to remember that when it comes to enforcement and implementation of sanctions, it largely rests on banks, businesses, and Canadians. So first, the problem of Canada's go-to legislation and the fact that how we sanction has had to change. The government of Canada says that sanctions are an important foreign policy tool and they must be applied judiciously in a targeted fashion, they must be coordinated, and they must be effective. Especially in the 1990s, the decade of sanctions, Canada was a supporter of what we call multilateral sanctions. They are mandatory UN sanctions required to return peace and order. Often it was to deal with conflicts in Africa. And certainly as a UN member, and because these were under Chapter 7, we had to comply. but we would often apply and then forget them. I note there are a few times where the UN has actually repealed sanctions and Canada was a little bit late to lift them as well. Today, because the UN Security Council is finding it more and more difficult to meet, to reach a consensus on how to deal with conflicts, especially by applying sanctions, we are now in the age of autonomous sanctions. And we have two pieces of legislation, which Danielle will be going over. One is the CIMA, the Special Economic Measures Act, and the other is our Magnitsky-style sanctions, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act. These are the most common sanctions applied by Canada, by the UK, by the EU, and similarly the US. We are anticipating that the new sanctions against Russia and officials in Ukraine, certain officials in Ukraine, will be forthcoming, but they are as of yet not officially in place. So the last sanctions under these autonomous type of sanctions that we put into place were actually against Myanmar. Canada doesn't have extra territorial reach, which means our sanctions are limited in terms of whom they can capture to any persons or entity located in Canada or Canadians located elsewhere or engaged in activities elsewhere. Now to the missing focus and coherence. If you look at the three types of sanctions legislation we have, you notice that the UN is very much focused on Africa. The CIMA is focused on problematic actors, including Syria, obviously Russia, Venezuela. And then we have these Magnitsky-style sanctions, which are going after individuals for gross violations of human rights or significant corruption. So the beauty of Canadian legislation is it can accommodate a number of situations. We can sanction states, entities, or individuals, and as you see, with a variety of different measures. But what we lack often is how we coordinate them with our allies, and also are our sanctions just one of several tools that we apply with the government of Canada in conjunction with NGOs and others to have a full spectrum of tools to address situations. Finally, sanctions can be effective. They are at best moderate in most cases. But for example, if we apply them early, and especially we consider how we threaten sanctions, and then put them in a timely way, they can be more effective. We also need to communicate to the targets that they are in fact sanctioned. The EU does this, for example, Canada does not. We need to make sure that they are coordinated, especially with allies, given these times, and also be prepared for retaliatory measures. We need to monitor and adjust them, not just fire and forget. We need to talk about enforcement. And of course, this is what Dr. Nesbitt will be talking about. And finally, we need to think about how we change the calculus of the targets. And when you consider that the penalties for our autonomous sanctions amount to $25,000 fine or a year in prison or up to 5 years in prison on conviction on indictment, $25,000 is not really enough in many cases, especially when we're talking about oligarchs, to change their mind. So now I will turn it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
And Danielle will be speaking next. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason and Dr. Charron. So I, like Dr. Charron mentioned, I'll be talking about Canada's two core pieces of autonomous sanctions legislation. The first is the Special Economic Measures Act, the CIMA, and the second is the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, which is sometimes called the JFAC-FOA, but most often it's referred to as Canada's Magnitsky Act. So you'll see here, just to provide a little bit of background on the CIMA and the JFAC-FOA. So as Dr. Charron mentioned, since 2017, Canada has this option to choose between using the CIMA or the JFAC-FOA when it has to resort to the use of autonomous sanctions meaning those that are imposed outside of the UN Security Council. So the CIMA was adopted in 1992, and at the time, it could really only be used in two specific cases. So the first was to address breaches of international peace and security, and the second was when an organization to which Canada was a member required sanctions to be imposed. So for example, through the Organization of American States. Then fast forward to 2016, Canada was required to undertake an evaluation of its existing sanctions legislation. And at the same time, this new type of sanctions legislation emerged, which we now sort of call this Magnitsky style legislation. And so for those of you who are unaware, this picture on the right-hand corner there is of Sergei Magnitsky himself. He was sort of the inspiration for this style of legislation. He was someone who was a tax auditor and lawyer. He worked for American billionaire Bill Browder in Russia. He had uncovered a corruption scheme, and after deciding to testify against those involved, he was detained in a Russian prison, and he actually died there at the age of 37 due to inhumane conditions. So then Bill Browder, his former employer, lobbied the US government and other successive governments to adopt this new style of legislation that would allow for targeting individuals directly with asset freezes and travel bans. So in 2017, Canada followed the suit of the US and adopted the similar style of legislation. And at the same time, the CIMA, which was being reviewed, was then updated to also allow for sanctioning to address gross and systematic human rights abuses and acts of corruption. So it was sort of felt that this updating of the CIMA and the JFAC-FOA's adoption would allow Canada this flexibility to keep pace with its allies. And importantly, this sanctioning with allies has become a really key aspect of Canadian sanctions practice. And in fact, it never sanctions alone, even when it's provided the option to do so, with these new updates that came in 2017. So as of 2017, you can see a bit more clearly now, Canada would have this choice between the two pieces of legislation. But as you can see, the CIMA can be used in 4 different circumstances now, whereas the JFAC-FOA can only be used in 2 cases. So just to highlight here, there is a little bit of overlap in terms of human rights abuses and then also corruption. But in practice, neither piece of legislation is typically used to address corruption alone. And in practice, when Canada has to resort to use sanctions outside of the UN to address human rights abuses, it typically uses the CIMA. And in fact, there have been 5 times as many individuals listed under the CIMA versus the JFAC-FOA for human rights abuses since 2017. So we don't really know the exact reason why the CIMA is preferred. We know that the JFAC-FOA has not been used since November of 2018, which is over 3 years now. But it's difficult to know why this is because a lot of Canada's decisions regarding who to sanction and why are subject to cabinet confidentiality. But we can kind of understand a couple of potential reasons that actually speak to limitations to the JFAC-FOA legislation. So first of all, the JFAC-FOA is typically used in response to isolated incidents, whereas the CIMA is used to respond to more widespread or systematic human rights abuses that are more connected to broader circumstances in a particular state. So in addition to being used to sanction those involved in Magnitsky's death, for example, the JFAC-FOA was used to sanction 17 individuals in connection with the extrajudicial killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So this sort of makes sense given that these incidents were murders and murder is not systematic. However, in the case of the poisoning and detention of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, the CIMA was used, despite the fact that this could arguably be seen as sort of a singular incident. So one potential reason for the use of the CIMA in that case might be because Canada couldn't really ignore the connection to the worsening situation in Russia as a whole, or just the connection to broader circumstances in the state, and that Canada wanted to make this connection. But if you look at some other limitations of the JFAC-FOA, we also see that the JFAC-FOA can't list entities. Under the CIMA, you can target states, entities, and individuals, whereas under the JFAC-FOA, you can only target individuals, but no states or entities. And that also means that the measures that can be imposed are also a little bit more limited. You can do asset freezes and travel bans against individuals, but you can't add additional measures if situations worsen over time. So whereas the Magnitsky case and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi are certainly incidences that have ended because they've resulted in a murder, the situation related to Navalny may be ongoing and may require more measures be applied over time. So overall, these are some of the limitations to the JFAC-FOA, and ultimately the CIMA has greater flexibility. This is just to provide a bit of an overview of how the legislation has been used in practice. As I mentioned, it's difficult to understand why it's used in particular cases, and the information that the public does have access to is typically not as well organized as you would like on the Global Affairs Canada Sanctions website, which I believe Jason will talk a little bit more about later. For example, most regulations have sections outlining exceptions to the measures in place, but these exceptions may be found under different headings and in many different places of the website. This can make public compliance difficult, and it's also compounded by the fact that the Government of Canada is not able to provide information about how to interpret the legislation. One thing that Canada is really transparent about, however, is the objectives of the sanctions. So in my own research, I found that among other objectives, such as to increase pressure on particular targets to change their behavior, the actual most commonly cited objective of the CIMA regulations was some variation of to align with allies or to signal to allies how Canada feels about a particular incident. And this is really interesting because it speaks to what Dr. Charron was saying about a lack of coherent foreign policy that Canada has. It means that aligning with allies is not only seen as a means to an end, as in a way to improve the bite of sanctions or to make them more effective against common targets, but it's also seen as sort of an end in itself. And this may mean that the other objectives of the sanctions are secondary, and that their actual effectiveness and coherence matter slightly less. So we also know that Canada never chooses to enact sanctions independently, meaning that even when, as I said, given the choice to act entirely unilaterally, it chooses instead to sanction in concert with allies. So this is a fairly important thing to keep track of over time to see how Canada continues to use both pieces of these legislation moving forward. So I'll end by just sort of summarizing the key challenges that I talked about. So one of these issues is the lack of coherence in the use of autonomous sanctions. So the fact that the key objective in many cases is just to align with allies without a key focus on the actual effectiveness of the measures themselves, although this can also be very complicated. The second is the limitations to the legislation's language and how it's actually able to be used in practice. As I mentioned, the issues with the JFAC-FOA and how it can only be used in more narrow cases. And the last thing is just the challenges regarding the communication of information, which I briefly touched on, but which will be discussed a little bit more in detail next. And there I will leave it off to Dr. Nesbitt. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Danielle. So now we have Dr. Michael Nesbitt, who is an associate professor at the University of Calgary Faculty of Law. And he's just getting his slides up there. Once he's there, he'll get started.
Yeah, and let me, as I'm doing this, thank you, Danielle and Andrea. That was really interesting. I enjoyed that a great deal. Okay. So there we go. I am going to talk to you a little bit about enforcement and its limitations in Canada. This could be honestly a 5-hour presentation, so I'm going to try to keep it to 5, and you're welcome to ask me questions when we get to that stage. I decided to focus on 3 problems in particular, although I think we could go farther than that. I think we could go certainly into coherence in much more detail, as Danielle directly addressed, into whether what we say we're doing is consistent with what we're actually doing in particular. But the 3 problems I decided to focus on was due process, and then just plain old process. When you're a lawyer and you focus on due process, you find you get to know the process a little bit, and that reveals sometimes other problems or difficulties. The second thing I want to focus on is sort of a very mini 1-minute case study on the troubles that the Canadian legislation, and I'll focus on CIMA in particular, has dealing with transshipments and sort of sanctions busting behavior. And the final problem I'll mention is a technical legal one, and that is the intelligence to evidence problem. I can get into that in more detail in questions or if people are interested, but I'll probably go through that one pretty quickly because again, from a legal side, it's a little bit technical. And so I'll leave it to the audience to sort out just how interested they are in some of those technical legal details. Okay, so let's start with that first problem I noted, which is due process and plain old process. And again, lawyers love tests of 3. If there's any lawyers in the audience, think the Oak test, 3, and then part 3, I think, was made into a sub 3 part test. So I'm going to do the same. I'm going to stick with 3 general problems and then 3 sub-problems here. The first one is just due process problems associated with the listing of people and entities. And so this can arise in different ways depending on the legislation you're talking about. Under the UN Act, the problem was that we listed entities and individuals based on what the UN Security Council listed. So if I'm an individual, Mike Nesbitt happens to be listed, and my bank account's frozen, and I find a nice lawyer who will take it pro bono because I can't pay a lawyer. That's one of the problems we've had with the legislation in the past. I then say, well, I'm not the Mike Nesbitt that was listed. You want a different Mike Nesbitt, don't you? Can you confirm for me, government, who you want, right? And the government will say, yeah, we want Mike Nesbitt from the UN Security Council list. I'll say, yeah, I know that. I don't know who that is, but it's not me, right? Like, it's a simple version of what's going to happen. And so the question then becomes, the next question is, well, even if you identify it as me, what's the basis for your listing, right? What are your justifications for doing this? For freezing my assets in the country, for ensuring that I can't pay my rent, my mortgage, whatever the case might be, right? And so there will be challenges, procedural legal challenges to the process. And if the process is simply, we stole it from a UN list, then you might run into real problems and you know, actions, debanking against the wrong people, for example. If you're operating under the CIMA where you're not taking those lists from elsewhere, and that was a sort of more historical example, the first one, then the question becomes very similar, but how are you coming up with the list, right? So in other words, is the due process sufficient such that you can justify the listing of the individuals? And I think more importantly for our purposes, can you identify, again, if you list Michael Nesbitt, can you identify which Michael Nesbitt that is? And this is where we get into the overlap of sort of fact and law, because if you look at the US listings, they will have Michael Nesbitt, date of birth, passport information, alias, and then about 2 paragraphs on details about me, you know, where to expect me, what industries I work in, and why I'm listed, a justification. If you look at the Canadian public justification, you see a name, right? And so who gets debanked? There are thousands of Michael Nesbitts in the world. Does all 5 Canadian banks debank everyone by the name of Michael Nesbitt? If not, the onus is on them to ensure they're getting the right person. With what information? What's the outreach with foreign affairs? Right? So you run into a series of what's your recourse if you've been debanked, right? If I don't have access, my funds are frozen, I can't pay my mortgage this month. What are my, you know, foreign affairs will say, it's not us, it's the bank. The bank will say, not us, foreign affairs told us to do this, right? Again, at a general level. So it's overstating the problem a little bit in that the banks work very hard and have onerous processes to identify the right people. But again, we're downloading this onto the private sector, into private hands, with private processes that aren't accountable publicly and aren't well known publicly. The second problem we have is related to that first one, which is a problem with the collection of open source intelligence. Sorry. So here you can imagine all sorts of problems. Do we get enough of it? Who's conducting it? If Foreign Affairs is in charge of this, who is it at Foreign Affairs that's trained in open source intelligence collection? As an ex-employee for Foreign Affairs, I can say that was not training that I received. Are diplomats good at this? What happens if you're trying to do open source and one of your targets notices, boy, there's an awful lot of hits from downtown Ottawa in Canada recently. Looks like I better go dark. There's a reason GCHQ may do some of this work for the Brits, right? So do we even have the internal capacity to do this work? Do we have business and financial intelligence knowledge? What's our training look like, and so on? The final problem here is the skill set and coordination needed. So do we have the ability to coordinate across departments where the knowledges are? And so we can talk about, and I think Andrea probably knows more details about what's happening now at GAC with a sanctions division, new sanctions coordination division. But the question historically was, If CBSA knows what's happening at the borders and the RCMP knows what's happening on the police side, and our intelligence agencies might have some intelligence, but foreign affairs knows the geopolitics of the listing and who's involved. And then of course, at the end of the day, the prosecutors are going to do it. Is there enough coordination in that complex web of transactions and the political will to go after what will be a very difficult prosecution investigation? Much easier to get someone for petty theft at a local convenience store, for example. Okay, the second problem I wanted to talk to you about was transshipment. And so I tried to, again, break it down into three. So what are the three ways we might get at sort of sanctions busting behavior? One is you find the goods at the border. Another is the banks identify the financial transaction that has run afoul of our, or purportedly run afoul of our sanctions. And the third is we get intelligence from somewhere. Human sources, financial intelligence, electronic intercepts, allied shared intelligence. I'm going to ask you to park that last one because that's our intelligence to evidence problem. So I want to focus on the other two. And in particular, I want to focus on the border one because I think the bank one is just, it has sort of been detailed already to some degree. And we can get into more detail if you have questions. But at the border, our legislation says, thou shalt not sell X type of arms to Iran. Okay. What if I send it to X type, we'll call them Viton O-rings, because that's one of the only cases we have of prosecutions in Canada, where a company out of my neck of the woods, Alberta, was selling Viton O-rings to Iran. What if I put port in Dubai on my shipping label? Viton O-rings can go to a port in Dubai. So does the border guard get that? I don't know. How do we capture it in the case I just mentioned? Clerical error, and the person accidentally, although they tried to put port in Dubai, I forget whether it's Dubai or Abu Dhabi, but one of the two, puts Iran, the end location, rather than the transshipped location. That's how we capture it. That's how we end up with prosecution. If there's no administrative screw up, we don't capture that. And we can't capture that because our legislation, for legal reasons that are beyond me, says we're not allowed to go after transshippers in Dubai because our sanctions with respect to Iran have to target Iranians. The alternative, and this is something you'll read in a lot of the legal literature, would be extraterritorial. Both those targets are extraterritorial. The target in Dubai is not extraterritorial in any meaningful way that is different from the target of Iran. Nevertheless, some sort of confusion there has persisted over 30 years with respect to our legal regime. And in part as a result, we are unable to have targets on the list of known transshippers. And if we don't have the known transshippers, it means you better hope the custom guard in Canada, who happens to be looking at the goods, is aware that this good, while it can go out of Canada, wouldn't be allowed to go out if it was going to Iran, and then knowing, oh, by the way, this port in Dubai, and I use that for good reason, is well known for transshipping, taking off the shipping label, putting on a new one and sending it to Iran. In other words, we're not likely to get, one would guess, many goods captured. That would be reflected in our prosecution record, which, as I said, is a total of 1 over 30 years, despite intelligence agencies around the world saying we have a bit of a transshipment, money laundering, sanction busting problem. Okay, and then our final problem here is just the bank. And Andrea mentioned this one, so I won't mention it in detail, but a lot is going to depend on the formal section. How do we capture the transaction? Well, we capture it if the bank captures it. So download responsibility to the bank. So what most countries do, makes a lot of sense. Our problem will be in that instance that, of course, if the formal sector isn't being used, if we can find a way around it, if you can trade in goods, right, before the advent of money, for example, if you have a crypto alternative, then you're not in the formal sector. And so this is what I think people will be looking at with respect to what Russia does to evade sanctions. Okay. just got a list of some solutions there, but I think the solutions go from everything to reevaluate how we coordinate and plan sanctions in Canada in terms of their enforcement, right down to can we extend the law, in particular, how do we get at transshippers, which we know is a problem, but which are not currently covered. And as far as I can tell, there is no strong legal justification for what we are asserting right now as a reason for not doing this. Okay, final one, which I said I wouldn't get into too much detail, but is your intelligence to evidence problem. And really quickly, that goes as follows. What was the third thing I said in the last 2 slides ago about how you capture someone? Well, you capture someone if you get intelligence from an intercept, from an allied country, etc. Your problem's going to be if it's from an intercept, it's probably not intended to target a transshipper or a sanction buster in the first place, right? It's more likely that it'll be going after spying of X country. And so now all of a sudden you have an investigation which, with respect to spying on X country or counter-espionage, which then turned up a little bit of information about someone who is engaging in sanction busting behavior. Why is that a problem? It's a problem because of disclosure in Canada. I show up and I want to know, what warrant did you have? What were your authority for intercepting my financials and my telephone calls, etc. Right? And the government doesn't want to give you those. And there's lots of legal reasons they can avoid it. But they don't want to give it because that background is really more about counter-espionage than it is about your piddly little case. And so just 2 summers ago, we saw a case fall apart. And we don't know why publicly, but it looks for all the world like it was something like this. We get information either during a counter-espionage operation, maybe from an ally. The ally doesn't want us to use it in court. And then we realize the basis for any information that we have all returns back to this original warrant, the justification for which can't be given in open court. Right, so this is a broader problem that we have. It's not insurmountable, but it's a broader problem we do have in prosecuting espionage, terrorism, money laundering, and sanctions.
Awesome, thank you for that, Dr. Nesbitt. Let's hope you're never the Mike Nesbitt on that list. So next up will be me and Erin speaking a little bit. So I'll let her go first. She's got a couple slides here. And then we'll talk, or I'll talk a little bit about the website we all created together after she's finished. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And thank you very much, Michael, Dr. Charron, and Danielle. So I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Charron in co-authoring an opinion editorial entitled Rethinking Sanctions, Important Questions for Canada to Consider, published by the CIC in May of 2020. The questions contemplated in the article are still very pressing today, and I'm therefore going to pose 3 questions discussed in the article that I believe Canada should be asking today. So hopefully you can see the first slide. There we go. So the first question is whether there has been too much reliance on sanctions against individuals via the financial asset freeze at the expense of other state-based measures, such as natural resource embargoes or expulsion from regional and other organizations, or even sports activities. The recent events that have taken place in Russia have made this question even more relevant and pressing. Many countries, including Canada, Britain, the United States, and Germany, have begun implementing financial sanctions in various tranches. In response to Russian actions, most recently, Canada has introduced financial penalties against Russian individuals and entities and has announced that they will halt all export permits. The US has taken a similar approach, targeting sanctions on significant Russian financial institutions, expanding sovereign debt prohibitions, and full blocking sanctions on Russian elites and their family members. Germany has frozen the certification of the Nord Stream 2 Baltic Sea gas pipeline project that was designed to double the flow of Russian gas directly to Germany. Will this have more of an impact than that sanctions that are finally being, will this have more of an impact now that sanctions that are finally strictly financially based? Or however, despite all of these measures, Russia has proceeded to invade the Ukraine on all 3 fronts. Will the German approach have some sort of different impact than ones that are strictly financially based, or will it have the same effect in that the impacts will also just be financial? Russia has proceeded to invade nonetheless, and the former Russian president Dmitry Medvedev went so far as to dismiss the German sanctions and state that Europeans would just face massive increases in gas prices as a result. With financial sanctions having been unsuccessful thus far in stopping or preventing an invasion by Russia, have we found ourselves in a situation that is beyond the reach of sanctions, or would natural resource embargoes or other state measures be more successful in curbing Russian actions? The second question is to be asked of Canada is if the primary goal of sanctions is to change target behavior, but sanctions are unable to elicit this, what might be more attainable secondary and tertiary goals? This question may be more difficult to consider in a live situation where there's little time to consider other attainable goals aside from stopping a state's immediate aggression. However, this is why it is so important for sanctions to be calculated and applied tactically, as the goals can and should go beyond stopping the immediate aggression. This is not to say that the primary goal of sanctions should not be to change behavior, but attention must also be given to the other goals that can be achieved through sanctions. For example, sanctions can be a starting point to investigations into money laundering and can assist in fostering change that goes beyond a country's immediate intentions. For example, the reporting and investigative obligations that arise through the imposition of sanctions and the ensuing requirements on countries and individuals to conduct diligence on who they are selling to or purchasing from can assist in the uncovering of illegal activity that did not form the basis for the original sanctions. And finally, the third question that Canada should be asking is whether senders like Canada review the measures that they apply, in many cases for decades, or is it more of a fire and forget situation? In conducting my research to compile the sanctions database, this issue came up consistently. Because the database tracked not only Canadian sanctions, but also EU, UN, and US measures as well, I was able to see a comparison in how and at what pace Canada reviews its measures as compared to other countries and international bodies. As Dr. Charron mentioned earlier, too often there were situations where Canada implemented sanctions in the heat of conflict, and then the sanctions were left in place long after hostilities have ended and other entities had removed their sanctions. In 2008, Eritrea was condemned by the international community for initiating hostilities at the Eritrea and Djibouti border. In 2009, the UN in response imposed sanctions on Eritrea, and the regulations implementing the UN resolution incorporated the sanctions into Canadian domestic law. In 2018, the UN repealed the regulations, and many others, including Russia, the UK, the EU, and Australia, swiftly followed suit. On the other hand, Canada kept the measures in place for another 2 years before finally repealing the sanctions on June 1st, 2020. And there was no explanation as to why the sanctions had remained in place this long. Such an approach leaves very little room for the consideration of the impacts of sanctions or an ability to adapt sanctions as required. When Canada fails to review and update its sanctions on a consistent basis, effectiveness and deterrence suffer. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to all the speakers. As everyone can see in the audience, there's quite a bit of information about sanctions, and it's a lot to take in, which kind of brings me to my point of the presentation, and that's showing the website we had the pleasure of creating under the direction of Dr. Charron. So our website is called CanadianSanctionsMap.com, and it's an interactive map that was created to make access to information about Canadian sanctions very easy. And so I just kind of wanted to talk about the benefits of what this project does kind of for people looking into sanctions. And of course, the volume of information brings me to my first point, and that's that the benefit of the map is that it provides a relatively simple way to obtain information about sanctions, which might be difficult to navigate typically from a layman perspective. So just for example, on Ukraine, you can click that on the map, and it takes you to information about sanctions with Russia and Ukraine. So that's kind of one of the key focuses of the map. I think that's the biggest benefit. But another thing about the map is that it highlights trends with Canadian sanctions activities. So as you can see, when you're looking at the dots on this map from far away, it highlights concentrations in certain regions of the world. And I think that's beneficial to people who are both professional and non-professional who are seeking information about sanctions and the uses by the Canadian government of sanctions, just because it provides a visual of those trends that might be harder to identify by sifting through text-based sources. Lastly, the map is an evolving document, and it's a centralized document as well. As demonstrated by the current conflict in Ukraine, it's obvious that sanctions and the international story surrounding sanctions is ongoing. And this map provides an easy access platform to where changes to Canadian sanctions activity can be easily updated and consolidated to avoid being lost in a forest of sanctions information that you can find elsewhere. So just for example of that, you can walk through the different pages that have information about Canada's sanctions policies and the different organizations you can get in touch with to find more information about this stuff. And so I think that really highlights the three benefits of this project. And it was a great pleasure to work with Dr. Charron and Erin and Danielle on this project. But that being said, I'd like to open up the floor for Q&A portion now, just to give the audience some opportunity to discuss what we've learned here tonight. So we do have one question from the audience, actually two. The second one just came in, but I'll start with that first one. And this is for anybody. Can Canada sanction Western enablers of Russia, especially the entities it uses for dirty money flows, such as banks, law firms, and real estate that may have operations in Canada under the existing legislation? And then it just goes on to kind of discuss some of those issues. The question asker also wonders what the reasons for these issues might be, and how the situation can be changed if these problems can't be addressed with current legislation. So that's for anybody.
Well, I can start, but I want to start first by saying I am just blown away by the work of Danielle and Erin and Jason. And whereas I am very, very concerned about the lack of coherence to Canada's sanctions and the legislation, we have La Relève right here, and they will make this better. They will make it searchable. They will make it user-friendly. They will make it coherent. So I think we're in excellent hands. I think that what, Dennis, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm thinking that you're essentially saying, why can't we just go out and, for example, sanction the VSB Bank of Russia directly? And the problem is that Canada's legislation doesn't allow for that kind of reach. What we can do is any Canadians that are connected to that bank, or any persons or entities in Canada, we can seize their assets or their property. But we don't have that ability like the US does. And this is where the US is so important, because they can, for example, strangle any Russian use of the US financial system. So there's something called the SWIFT code, and on Twitter it was described by Daniel really well. SWIFT, if you think about your house, how you heat your home, SWIFT is the thermostat of your house. There's the ductwork that gets the heat to you. The US can go after that thermostat. It can also go after the ductwork, the different flows of monies. The targets are always working to circumvent them. Canada can only go after some of the ductwork if it is in Canada, and certainly our chances of getting access to the thermostat are limited. But with this age of autonomous sanctions, if you have the EU putting in sanctions and Canada putting in sanctions, and you have the US and Australia and Japan, then we start to look like we have the effect of multilateral sanctions, but we're doing it autonomously in a concerted way.
Any other speakers want to address that question?
I can jump in real quick with just an explanation as to how the US is doing that in some ways that we're not. In some ways, they have what are called secondary sanctions. So that allows them to sort of take jurisdiction over a dispute between two third parties. So when I think of extraterritorial, that's what I think of. When I said in my presentation, all of these are at some level extraterritorial, but not that much. It's because, as Andrea just described, what we're doing is taking jurisdiction. We're essentially saying, we're going to target X bank in Russia, but what we're actually doing is taking jurisdiction over Canadians and those in Canada. So we're just saying we're cutting off that bank from doing business with Canadians, Canadian businesses, et cetera. And if Japan does the same thing, and Australia does the same thing, and then we start to do pretty well. The US does two things. One, it says, we're going to go after anyone else that deals with someone in some cases, right? So they can go after sort of that bank in Russia deals with X bank in China to evade our sanctions. We can take jurisdiction, but they're the way they are able to take jurisdiction is really interesting. And that's if the money goes through, as I understand it, US currency at some point, then they're taking jurisdiction. And so this is hotly debated in international law as to whether that's legal. But the reality is one of the reasons you can't find many countries doing that is because there's one, maybe two countries that have the power to do that. It's something like 80% of, I'm going to get the stats wrong here, but of transactions go through the US dollar, and 60-80% of them actually go through the US or go through New York City at some point, right? So they're able to find this lever for jurisdiction, which again is debated in international law. Canada hasn't liked it a couple of times where we've seen secondary sanctions with respect to Cuba, but that's how they're able to do it in a way that not only are we not able under our law, but we don't have the economic might that the US does.
I just want to add too, we don't have something called the 50% rule that the US has. So for example, let's say I'm a bad actor in Canada. I simply put my house in my husband's name. I still own the house, but it can't be touched because we don't have this 50% rule. So also being very specific about definitions of property versus assets versus liability and all those things, we still need some clarification in some cases.
Absolutely. So I'll move on to the next question, and it has to do with Russian money laundering in Britain. So the question is, given how much Russian money is laundered through Britain, would it be effective to take sanctions against Britain to target laundered Russian money due to the billionaires and stuff like that are operating in Britain? And that's for any speaker as well.
Well, that would certainly be out of the box thinking, but what we're trying to do is get the allies to all work against the targets as opposed to us turning against each other as senders. One of the things we know will happen is there will be retaliatory sanctions. And so we know that's going to come from the targets like Russia. So we don't want to have to deal also with potentially retaliatory sanctions against allies. So you will see a lot of news in the UK because they do know that they have a lot of Russian oligarchs with property and assets in London. It's a very desirable place to live. And so they are trying to find ways to tighten those screws. But for example, whereas the US has no compunction about sanctioning family members. So the oligarchs send their sons and daughters to the elite schools around the world. We won't sanction, Canada and the UK and others won't sanction family members because we spent the decade of the 1990s recognizing we have to try and limit the unintended consequences of sanctions. The US will. And that's something maybe in the case of Russia, we need to think about. It worked very, very well against Charles Taylor in Liberia when we started to sanction his wife, who couldn't travel to Paris to buy nice clothes. That sharpened the Taylor household quite quickly. There were obviously other reasons, but the oligarchs leave Russia for a reason to be able to travel, shop, be educated elsewhere in the world. Those are the kinds of sanctions we need to put in place because they will only go against those elites and will protect innocent Russians. I am very concerned about, turning off all the taps to banks in Russia. Sounds like a great idea, but we could have a humanitarian disaster, which Putin, as we've seen Saddam Hussein, use as a rally round the flag effect and say, see, it is the West. They are the evil ones. It's not me, even though the sanctions are being manipulated by him.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think that's one thing we've seen throughout this crisis in Ukraine is that there's been a lot of tiptoeing around making sure the West and Ukraine have not given Russia misinformation ammunition to distribute as propaganda, as like false flag operations and stuff like that. So I think that's a great point. For Danielle and Erin, I think this question would be suited for both of you. From your experience in gathering the data and just learning extensively about sanctions, would you say that they have a slow impact action, or can they have an immediate effect as well?
In terms of when you're talking about an immediate impact, I would say that the sanctions come into effect. And I think this also sort of speaks to the other question that's there about what impact have our sanctions against Russia had in the past. So they would be in effect as soon as they're published officially through the Canada Gazette. And in this specific case, we haven't really seen, at least unless it's happened during this exact call, but we haven't seen the actual sanctions that Canada has talked about really been actually published. And so the details are available to us, but they would be in effect right away. But it's really hard to measure the impact. And so there's a couple of ways that you can sort of measure impact or whether or not they've really taken effect in a meaningful way. And one of the ways that we've talked about is through whether or not they imposed retaliatory measures. So that would just prove that they care about the fact that they're being sanctioned. They're aware that they're being sanctioned, that it sort of caused them to have a response to that. So for example, Canadian MPs have been sanctioned in response to our sanctions imposed against Russia in relation to the poisoning and detention of Alexei Navalny. So that can be sort of a way to measure impact. And that happens rather rapidly. Sometimes that happens even the next day after the sanctions are announced. In other cases, it can be sort of a longer period of time. For example, the use of Magnitsky-style legislation, that legislation was sort of a new type of sanctions that was being imposed. So it did take a little bit of time for that to come into effect, but that actually had the impact that there was an investigation into the death of Magnitsky, and then there was actually more information came out of that, and why he died and what happened, and actually, so he was sort of brought to justice as a result of that. So in that case, that was it was a good impact, but it also took a little bit more time. So I hope that sort of answers the question about long-term versus short-term impacts, and please feel free to add other things. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Erin, if you feel like you can add to that, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think Danielle covered it there, but I think just to kind of echo what she said, as I'd mentioned with the Eritrea example, for as an instance where the UN had passed a resolution, and so it was automatic based on the legislation that Canada has, but you won't necessarily see that that regulation or the implementation of that right away on the Canadian website. And then I think that oftentimes in terms of the research that I did, I saw the leg on the other end. So when those sanctions were actually repealed by other bodies or by other countries. And so that's where I saw Canada lagging more. I think because when they're first implemented, sometimes it's automatic. So Canada can actually lag behind because it just happens automatically. But whether it's actually taken note of and actually posted on the site is a completely different matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just posted for everybody, the sanctions are now in effect. They've finally been posted. What would be really nice is, like in the US and the UK and EU, you can get email notifications going, they're in place, and you've got one-stop shopping. With Canada, you got to keep going back to check the list. So we lose a bit of precious time, but the one thing we have on there is sanctions against debt financing. And so that means that can be really interesting, because it says it's prohibited for any person in Canada and any Canadian outside of Canada to transact, provide financing, or otherwise deal in new debt directly and indirectly, including bonds, loans, debentures, extensions of credits. So that is sort of out of the box thinking to try and get at these oligarchs. So it's worth checking out.
Yeah, and email updates might be something we can look into on the website. So I do have a question here that's for everyone, but I'll start by directing it to Dr. Nesbitt, because I think you would have an interesting perspective on this. So the question is, with the current Russian-Ukrainian conflict, if you had the ability to craft Canadian sanctions, what would you recommend as ones that would be effective and enforceable? So we can start with Dr. Nesbitt, and then we'll work our way around if anybody else has anything to add.
I don't have a good answer to that. Can I pass it to Erin, because I feel like this touches on because I feel like throwing her under the bus. No, because I feel like this touches on some of her questions and sort of alternatives and thinking outside of the box as to how to get this. And that policy side of thing, it beats me.
Yeah, no, and I think that, like, obviously I discussed the impact of financial and kind of as we're seeing that those have been implemented by several different countries and entities, and so far, obviously, Russia has just carried on. I would be interested to see when I saw the German sanction in terms of the pipeline. I thought at first that maybe that one was more natural resource related, but it does seem to be kind of more financial as well, just because of the gas is actually going from Russia to Germany and not Germany to Russia. But I think if the situation was reversed and it was a situation where the resources were being provided to Russia, I think I would be interested to see the impacts. And I think that there maybe would be more of an impact if it was a natural resource sanction as opposed to financial, because as we've seen and as Dr. Sharon mentioned, Putin, I don't think cares about the financial aspects in terms of citizens. And as she mentioned, for example, banks, and why we can't just sanction the banks, because then you might have a humanitarian crisis on your hands. So I think you do need to get creative in those ways. But again, a natural resource embargo could cause humanitarian issues as well. But I definitely don't think that the financial ones are having the impact right now. But it also could be a situation, I mean, you're dealing with a leader who doesn't really seem to care. So I think that also just kind of throws a wrench into it as well, unfortunately.
Any of the other speakers?
Well, this may not address it directly, but I think too that we're forgetting some of the lessons learned from past sanctions. If you think about South Africa and the apartheid policy, the sanctions that actually did the most harm were the voluntary measures, such as preventing the South African cricket team from participating in any international events, and an embargo, a voluntary embargo on any South African wines. And when you get to those things that are at the heart, very special to the people, you can imagine if Canada was told you cannot compete in any international hockey events. That would cause everybody to pause and think about it. And so these kind of diplomatic and sporting events, we've sort of forgotten about as a bygone era. But I think we have to put all things on the table. I also think, and I can't even believe I'm saying this, but something like the Arctic Council, which Russia, I think, does value, and is one of 8 Arctic states, as is the US and Canada and Norway and Finland, Sweden and Iceland and Denmark. We had this conversation in 2014. Should we kick out Russia for their annexation of Crimea? I suspect that conversation is going to have to happen again. And I'm not so sure there will be as many voices saying we need to keep Russia in, which is going to have then devastating consequences for the cooperation we've had in the Arctic. But I have never seen such a rupture in international law. And so I think being constrained by old ways, we're going to have to heed those lessons, but also is now the time to rethink those lessons.
So in the interest of time, I think we have about 3 minutes left. So I'll ask one more question here. So this person asked about Biden's words today, and during his speech, he said that the threat of sanctions were never going to stop Russia from moving forward with its invasion of Ukraine, and that their real utility would be punishing Russia after the fact. So with this in mind, can sanctions have a dissuasive effect, preemptive effect, or are they mostly a punitive tool? And that's for everyone.
Well, there's a whole database you can go to that's tested this. It's called the Threat and Imposition of Sanctions Database, the TIES database. It's by Clifton Morgan and others in the United States. And he said, one of the problems is we've always measured sanctions effectiveness at the time we put them in, but we don't ever study what happens if we threaten them. And in that ties database, there are examples of where you threaten sanctions and they have changed the target behavior. So of course, it never is counted as sanctions because they're not put into place. So that's, you know, the benefit of the research that students like this do. We have that information. We now need to go and look at it and see if it can be applied in this situation.
Could I just jump in and also add, just from the Canadian perspective specifically, though, the one challenge is just that when we look at the type of objectives that Canada has with its sanctions, as I was discussing earlier, in certain cases, its objectives are going to be different. And so if the types of sanctions that Canada is imposing are rather symbolic or just to align with allies, I mean, certainly in this case, you would think that that's not the case. And they, of course, want to have an impact on behavior. But we know that obviously Canada doesn't have the type of reach and the type of bite with its sanctions that its allies do. So it just matters that it's acting in alignment with its allies on this. So if you were talking about just Canada's sanctions, for example, you may not really see that level of effectiveness in threatening the sanctions, for example, in advance. But of course, what Dr. Charron is saying is about this more multilateral use of autonomous sanctions. So multilateral use of sanctions outside of the UN. Thanks.
If anyone else has anything to say of the speakers, now's the time. Otherwise, I'll wrap it up. So I'll give the floor to Brad Curvison, the current Vice President of the Winnipeg branch of the CIC.
Thanks, Jason. And I'd like to echo Jason's thank you to the speakers tonight for sharing your insights and taking the time to spend it with the CIC and our audience. There's certainly a lot of interest in sanctions right now, especially in light of the most recent events. I think we're going to hear a lot about them in the next few days and weeks. So this has been an excellent primer in terms of the way the sanctions work and for the excellent work that a number of the folks have done on the database. So I think some of us are going to be consulting that to see what sanctions are in place. I'd also like to thank Jason for his work in setting up the session tonight. He did most of the work in arranging the speakers and looking after the logistics. And it's also like to thank him for his excellent work as moderator for keeping the trains running on time, so to speak. So I trust everyone enjoyed tonight's presentation. We're pleased that you were able to join us. Please consider signing up for future notifications from the CIC, either on our Twitter or Facebook site, or please consider becoming a member of the CIC, where you'll be informed of events like these at branches across the country. Talking about Russia and Ukraine, we will have an event coming up in the near future to explore the consequences of the invasion further. Sanctions is going to be a part of that, as well as looking more broadly at how this affects Canada and other actions that we can take, considering our interests in the region. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Have a good night and look forward to seeing you at a CIC event very soon.